Amen. Okay, we are almost at the end of Leviticus. A few chapters left. Tonight we're going to be in chapter 25. This is kind of a neat chapter. Studying this one the last couple of days, I think chapter 25 is probably at this point. We'll see what 26 and 27 hold. But at the moment, chapter 25, I think, is my favorite chapter in the book of Leviticus. It's just a neat section, which is something else because it's a very long section. So there's no guarantees we're even going to make it through the chapter tonight. But essentially what we're going to see in the first 7 verses, you can kind of break the chapter down in half. In the first 7 verses, we see the concept of the Sabbath of the 7th year. So we went through it in Exodus. We went through a little bit previously in Leviticus. They would work the land 6 years. The 7th year, they would neither reap nor sow. And we've discussed in the past how problematic that can be. Connor, can you get me a bottle of water, please? That hasn't been opened yet. So we can see how problematic that would be. But the rest of the section, the rest of this chapter, what we're going to be dealing with, thanks, bud, you're awesome, is the year of Jubilee. So they would have 49 years, which would bring them to a Sabbath year. So they'd have to let that year be fallow. They would neither reap nor sow. That brings us into the 50th year, the year of Jubilee. Another year where they were not allowed to reap nor sow. So now that's 2 years. When they're dominantly agrarian and they have to take food from the land, then they can now not reap nor sow for 2 years. We see how we get to that place of, living by faith. We're going to see that as kind of our dominant theme for chapter 25. So there's a lot of neat stuff packed into this one. So chapter 25, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord." So the first 2 verses are just kind of neat. First, we have location. In verse 1, we see their current location still at Mount Sinai. And we're going to see kind of that location all the way until I think about Numbers chapter 10. And then we follow up right after that. The message that he is giving to the people is essentially, at this point, a reminder of the promise. When you come into the land. I really love that passage because the promise did not just go away. What do we mean by that? At this point, they're thinking their entrance into the promised land is going to be roughly, less than 30 days. They're pretty close at this point. So the promise seems very close. But because we've already read our Bibles, we know it's closer to like 40 years and a month from this point. And it's easy to think that the promises of God are just going to dissipate or go away because of disobedience. We see that this promise isn't going to dissipate. We're going to figure it out real quick when we get into the book of Numbers, that once they get to the promised land, they're going to send spies into the land. 10 of those spies are going to come back with a very adverse report. We can't go in there. There's giants in the land. There's walled cities in the land. They've got weapons. And we've got, dudes, dudettes, and goats. Like, we don't stand a chance with these guys. But 2 other people came back. Caleb and Joshua. They came back with grapes the size of your face. And like, you know what? We need to go now. We're fine. Like, those guys, they're gonna fold. They're gonna yield. Like, we're gonna conquer the land. The land is for us. We need to go in there right now because this truly is the land of milk and honey. And they trusted the witness of the 10 instead of the witness of the 2. And they chose not to go into the land. To add insult to injury when the Lord said, okay, you're not going into the land. This is paraphrased, obviously. He was like, we're going to wipe out this generation. You're going to be wandering through the desert for 40 years. The next generation will go into the land. What did they do at that point? Our bad. Let's go take the land now. You remember they crossed over, tried to take the land, and they ended up with a whooping. Then they wandered the desert for 40 years. The promise did not dissipate. It still stands. When you come into the land will also hold a Sabbath. That would have been kind of a scary concept for a year, and we'll get into it a little bit more, but for a year, neither reaping nor sowing. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land. I lost my place, and that was fast. A Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land. And the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you. For you, your male and female servants, your hired man, and the stranger who dwells with you, for your livestock and the beasts that are in your land. All its produce shall be your food. So we have a whole bunch of stuff really mixed into this section. So for starters, we discussed a little bit last week in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 9 through 13. It says that every year they're coming into this, the Sabbath of the 7th year, they had to read the law. So they had this constant reminder of what they're supposed to be doing, but also why they're doing it. This is a Sabbath. Even the Sabbath of the land was to the Lord. Guzik points out it's a demonstration that the land belonged to God. That's a pretty serious demonstration, because a land that is a nation, essentially, that takes a great deal of its food from its kind of agricultural setting, they're only allowed to eat what grows extra. No reaping, no sowing. So it's that demonstration of faith in the Lord that he is going to provide for the people. It's just neat because it's a radical demonstration to everybody else. It's not just a demonstration to the neighbor. It's a demonstration to everybody else. And Guzik does make the point that it's a radical demonstration because it doesn't make any sense. We do very much get wrapped up in the logic of things, in the number crunching of things. This is something that just, it doesn't make sense to do it God's way. It makes sense that we really should work, and that kind of mentality really gets people in trouble. This chapter was a very hard one because we have the Sabbath of the 7th year, and we have the Year of Jubilee. We have it commanded here in chapter 25, but we don't have it demonstrated anywhere biblically. We have no biblical record that they actually stuck to it. Disobedience in one area snowballs, and it snowballs quickly. From this point, once they came into the land, we know they had their period of conquering. We're going to go through that when we move through the book of Joshua. Shortly after their occupation of the land brings us to the period of the Judges. How hard would it be to track every 49th and 50th year, especially when you're facing occupation? We know that they didn't have this solid track of obedience because of what's given to us in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, which we will have up there on the screen for you. Beginning in verse 19. Then they burned the house of God, this being Babylon, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, which was in 539 BC, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land has enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So because of all of these Sabbaths for the land that they skipped, that's why they went into Babylon for 70 years. We know why they went into Babylon as we went through the book of Daniel, but that is why they went into Babylon for 70 years, so that the land would have her Sabbaths all of those times that it was skipped. And we can kind of understand the place of the skipping. How hard is it right now for us to take a break? Well, if I don't work, we don't eat. I don't have time to focus on the fellowship. I don't have time to focus on my studies or my reading, or, I have time for a 2-minute prayer, but nobody has time for a 10-minute prayer. And it impacts us. It moves us from living a life of faith, obedience, and something quite a bit more rigid and inflexible. So we have this calling to live by faith, and it's a demonstration not just for the neighbor. It's not just a demonstration for me to move in some place of obedience, to encourage you to move in some place of obedience, but also everybody else, because everybody on the outside who's focused more on the things of the world might look at the things that the church is doing and say, that is the weirdest thing I've ever seen anybody do. That doesn't even make any sense. And what's crazy about the weird stuff that the church is supposed to be doing is we still function with a full cup of joy, while everybody else is still in the grinder with quite a bit less joy, or something quite a bit more perishable. So call to that place of faith. Verse 8 brings us to the introduction of the year of Jubilee. And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself. 7 times 7 years, 49. And the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall make the trumpet to sound throughout your land. So on this year of Jubilee, the trumpet is sounded on the Day of Atonement, what we discussed last week. You have atonement, and then you have liberty proclaimed. Just kind of interesting how those two fit together, being where we are in the New Testament. So on the Day of Atonement, and we've already discussed what's going to happen there last week, then they're going to move into, on that 50th year, the year of Jubilee. You shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land. To all its inhabitants, it shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee to you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of its own accord, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. So we see again this second year where the land is going to go fallow, but they're all called to return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. This one is kind of a semi-foreign concept for us. What is the big deal with the possessions? What is the big deal with everybody returning to their land? We've already discussed that the land is not supposed to be sold permanently. Why sell the land? If you are becoming impoverished, or you can't work the land, you could sell the land, you could lease the land. You were able to buy back the land. Or the kinsman redeemer, the goel, something we have been discussing, if they were able and willing and a close relative, they would be able to buy back the land. But the year of Jubilee, everybody had to. People would buy other people's land so that they could make more money. They would come in for X amount of years, or whatever period of time it is. They would grow stuff, they would reap the benefits of it before it would go back to the original owner. And we'll continue to break that down as we move through it. So it shall be holy to you. You shall eat its produce from the field. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his possession. And if you sell anything to your neighbor, or buy from your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor, and according to the number of years of crops he shall sell to you. According to the multitude of years you shall increase its price. According to the fewer number of years you shall diminish its price. For he sells to you according to the number of years of the crops. Therefore you shall not oppress one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. So if you buy a piece of land, and the closer you get to the end of your ownership of that land, you're not supposed to increase the price of the land to sell it back to them, but rather it is supposed to decrease. They're stopping, it's kind of a neat little law for this society. They're stopping like a permanent underclass. So that makes sense to everybody. After every 50 years, essentially things get reset. The land, again, not supposed to be sold permanently. And what I really enjoy, especially in verse 17, it says, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. What does that mean? And why does that matter to what we had just read? The Lord is telling him every 50th year, you're going to continue to let the land grow fallow. That's hard. Could you imagine working for 6 years and taking the whole year off? Some of us, myself included, that sounds so awesome. I don't think anybody would be able to find me unless they're in Carlsbad and they love surfing, because that's where I would stay in my camper and I would be a beach bum. The concept of just not working for a year, while that makes me happy on the other side of the coin, I think I would get stir crazy. I would have to do something. Or we'd start to look at some of the scarcity in our shelves and think we would have to do something more. It's interesting that we don't have a biblical account of their obedience to the Year of Jubilee. There are rabbis and their teachings which still don't teach obedience. What a lot of people would do is they would lease their land on the year of the Sabbath or the time of Jubilee. They would lease their land, sell their land to a Gentile, someone who didn't have to hold the laws of the Sabbath. Their land would still be worked, and then they would just reclaim their land after the Sabbath or the Year of Jubilee was over. Because once you let your land go fallow for a year or 2 years, what do you got to do when you come back to it? You've got some cleaning up to do. Probably a lot of it, depending on the shape of your land. I leave my yard alone for 5 minutes. I'll spend the next 2 weeks trying to weed it out. So we see him trying to circumvent the law a little bit. But it's easy to say, well, I'm not working it on the Sabbath. So when he says, you shall fear the Lord your God, I am the Lord. They were called to be in awe of the Lord and hoping in the things and the fulfillment of his word, which we'll continue to get into, but to do it his way. And sometimes his way, his math, just doesn't really add up like we would like to add up math. You know, we had a conversation about the Trinity. A lot of people say, well, how do you really explain the Trinity? 1 + 1 + 1 = 1. And I've got like homeschooling moms in here. They're just like, you know what? That's why your kids count like this. And it's like, well, Bible math, God's math is interesting. The way that he calls us to do it, it's different for a reason. I should also point out that it's hard for a reason. But we have cups full of joy for a reason. There truly is something to be said for doing it God's way. That we need to be fearing the Lord. That's tethered immediately to those verses 15 and 16, because it would be easy to try to cheat your brother. When things are hard, it would be easier to try and just stay one step ahead, stay one length beyond the curve ahead of everybody else. God is saying you're not going to do it that way because every other nation was used to doing it that way. Verse 18, so you shall observe my statutes, keep my judgments, and perform them, and you will dwell in the land safely. It's just kind of neat how all four of those things in verse 18 fit together. So they had to observe the statutes and keep the judgments, which means they first had to know them. But the problem that we have now, it's the same one they had all that long ago. It can't just stay head knowledge. You have to execute. You have to practice said head knowledge. They had to perform them. One thing to memorize them, one thing to know them, but they had to actually perform them, to follow through as the Lord had commanded them to do, and it was followed by a promise. You will dwell in the land safely. We obviously saw in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 that they had the knowledge, but they did not execute. They did not perform the things that the Lord had said, and therefore they did not dwell in the land safely. We know that in 722 BC, Israel went into captivity, and in 605 BC, Judah went into captivity, 70 years. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell there in safety. Verse 20, and if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce? I love that passage because it's in these passages that it's very directly speaking to us. And it kind of hurts the heart a little bit. This one, and I feel that we can kind of talk in a little more transparency. One of the things that we've been working on, my family and I, prayerfully, is we are leaving a job that I love very much, that has kept me sustained, and we're going to do something less so I can minister more. And to make matters worse, because I work for a corporation and I am a salesman, I'm trained by like better salesmen. Like they know what's up. And you know what they hit me with in the last week? You know we're going into a recession, right? What are you going to do? That's because of who I am, and I'm bad at it. I start doing math, bad math, Marine Corps math, where the numbers also don't add up, but not in the biblical way. God speaks to us just like this. How are we going to eat if we can neither sow nor reap? Lord, how am I going to sustain? How am I going to feed my family? We'd like to think it just stays there and it stays in this noble place, because we're called to be responsible and protect our families, to have livelihood. But it doesn't stay noble, does it? Lord, I like to fish. Jigs are getting expensive. What about my boat? What about this? And it just multiplies. And the thing that God gave me out of Matthew chapter 6, seek first the kingdom of heaven, all these other things we added to you. Probably not the fishing lures, but your sustenance. Lures would be nice too. But we have that question essentially proposed. And what God is doing is speaking directly to the heart of people. What shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce? Kind of points us back to verse 17. You shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. Verse 21 says, then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. That's a whole different kind of promise. Like you kind of catch like the authority and the deliverance. Yeah. Right? Deliverance? It's a deliberate word. We're just going to go with that one. He's going to command the blessing. That not only are they going to be taken care of that first year, but they'll also have produce for the next 2 years. Rarely. And I truly believe that we should, but rarely do we, if you'll let me say it, rarely do we challenge the Lord in this. We are called not to test the Lord, very specifically, except in one area. What area is that? Essentially tithes and offerings. Here, they're called to test with even far more than tithes of offerings. But we see this concept of, you know what? You're going to take this rest. You're going to give the land its rest. If you stick to my word, if you truly believe the things that I'm telling you, this is going to be the outcome. So we see quite the serious outcome. He's going to command blessing. And you shall sow in the 8th year and eat old produce until the 9th year, until its produce comes in. You shall eat of the old harvest. Verse 23, we move into another section, the redemption of property. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. Awesome. We often think of not just people being set apart and sanctified to the Lord, but this land, period, is not supposed to be given out anywhere permanently, because it actually doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the Lord, and thusly he imparts it to who he sees fit. But he also continues with, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. That's awesome. We see the same thing echoed in 1 Peter chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 11, that our real home is in heaven. So the land is not going to be sold permanently. And in the land, verse 24, of your possession, you shall grant redemption of the land. Couldn't be imparted permanently. In Joshua chapters 13 through 21, after they kind of had this conquering phase, they broke down the land and allotted the land to the tribes. We're going to see in this section and continuing that we're really only discussing the lands meant for farming, if you will. Land could not be sold permanently. Every 50th year had to go back to the owner. If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold. Or if the man has no one to redeem it, but he himself becomes able to redeem it, then let him count the years since its sale and restore the remainder to the man whom he sold it, that he may return to his possession. But if he is not able to have it restored to himself, then what was sold shall remain in the hand of him who bought it until the year of Jubilee. And in the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his possession. If a man sells a house in a walled city, then he may redeem it within a whole year after it is sold. Within a full year he may redeem it. But if it is not redeemed within the space of a full year, then the house in the walled city shall belong permanently to him who bought it throughout his generations. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. Only pertaining to land outside of a walled city. So if they decide to not, if you will, work the land, and they want to live inside the city, inside a walled city, and they buy a house, if they sell that house, it's fair game. That occupant is able to keep it, unless they try and redeem it within a year. Verse 31, however, the houses of villages which have no walls around them shall be counted as the fields of the country. They may be redeemed, and they shall be released in the year of Jubilee. Nevertheless, the cities of the Levites and the houses in the cities of their possession, the Levites may redeem at any time. So it didn't pertain to the Levites. Such a neat thing. The Levites, if you remember in Joshua, the Levites did not receive a portion of the land. It says that the Lord is their inheritance. So they didn't have any part in the agrarian kind of concept of things. So if they bought a house or they owned a home within a walled city, it was essentially reconciled to them as the land was to everybody else. If a man purchases a house from the Levites, then the house that was sold in the city of his possession shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses in the cities of the Levites are their possession among the children of Israel. But the field of the common land of their cities may not be sold, for it is their perpetual possession. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him, like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. So now we get to the concept of the poor. So far in this section, we're seeing this great reliance on the Lord. I think few of us kind of have an easy time reconciling some of this because we're not, landowners or farmers or things of the sort. But the occupation of the land was a huge deal. Them being able to maintain that portion of the promise was a big deal. When you sold your land, being able to get your land back was a huge deal. We see all of these covenants throughout the Word, and we see a lot of them really are kind of kingdom covenants. And we've seen throughout the course of the Word how many issues we've had over the land. Between kings, within the land, other nations, we've seen them kind of fighting over it. We saw this move, if you will, that not just stops like a permanent underclass, but also speaks very directly to the heart. So here in verse 35, we see the concept of lending to the poor. And we see a very sharp command that you shall help if one falls into poverty. And help means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Sometimes it's a situation that it's like, well, you know what, the best thing we do, we're just going to throw money at it. And we get this idea that money fixes everything. This concept of helping is a little more interesting in these next couple of verses. It says, verse 36, take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your God. So we have a couple of different little insights. So he says you're going to help. And you're not going to take any usury or interest, but you're going to fear the Lord. That you're going to be in obedience to the Lord. Why is that in there? Some of us have had house guests that stay guests for kind of a long time. And it's taxing, isn't it? They eat more food. Your food bill goes up. While everybody at your house might take, what we call Navy showers, it might be a 2 to 5 minute shower. Sometimes a house guest might take a 30-minute shower. Nothing is cheap. Nothing is free. Now, we do have the concept in the Pauline epistles, if they don't work, they're not going to eat. But it's also not he's not being commanded just cut him loose or throw him out, but he's going to help him. And he talks about bringing him in as a guest in the home. He's going to live with you. And he says, you're going to fear the Lord. It's like, he took a lot from me. I need to get all of mine back. So we start kind of adding our own little interests or taxes or whatever the case may be. God's saying, you're not going to do that. You're going to count on me to take care of you. He says, I am Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. They didn't deliver themselves. They weren't able to free themselves from bondage. When they came out of the land of Egypt as slaves, then obviously freedmen, generally they would have come out with empty pockets. But they didn't. The Lord had ended up providing for them. Remember that story as we're going through the book of Exodus. So he gives the same warning here. I am the Lord your God. Thusly, you're going to do things my way. Again, it doesn't really make any sense. So it kind of puts the ball back in the court of, well, we need to do math God's way or be obedient God's way. If one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Shouldn't be trying to compel him into slavery, which we discussed in Exodus, but rather the concept should be to pick him up. We're going to go into a very hard section, which is what's next, dealing with slavery. Again, like we discussed in Exodus, not the same kind of slavery that we are used to dealing with. If someone became poor and were having a hard time keeping up on the land or paying the bills, they would sell themselves to a brethren, sometimes to Gentiles. They would work off their debt in order to try and redeem the property. Essentially, that's what we're dealing with here. Then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possessions of his fathers, for they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. They belong to the Lord. He's making the point very clear. They're going to be treated a certain way. They're going to be housed a certain way. They're going to be respected, taken care of as family because they belong to God. Such a fascinating concept. If we truly believed or just understood who it is that we belong to, how would that change how we treat one another? You shall not rule, verse 43, over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God. And as for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And the rabbis, mixed with what we see in Exodus 20, they are brought into the family. They're treated like family. They're taken care of. And assuming that their debt was not paid is kind of rendering how long they're going to be with the family. And you may take them as inheritance for your children, after you to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves, but regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor. Now if a sojourner or a stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you or to a member of the stranger's family, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him. Or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him in his family may redeem him, or if he is able, he may redeem himself. It brings us back to the concept, one that I love very much, of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer had to meet this criteria to redeem back property or to redeem back people. And it's just neat that this section is in here, being redeemed or being sold to someone that is far away and needing to be redeemed by either a kinsman redeemer or redeemed in your own efforts. And we've seen how hard it is to be redeemed in our own efforts, which brings us back to the goel. It had to be someone that was willing and had to be somebody that was able. Those two kind of make sense. The one that I really enjoy is it had to be someone that was near of kin, which brings us to the concept of the Son of Man. And we see kind of just this flow through the whole word. We'll be able to expound on it more once we get to the book of Ruth. But Jesus had to be brought forth in the likeness of man. That high priest who knew our weaknesses, we see that concept as well. And we see his family tree spanning all the way back. So he was able to pay the price, the only one. He was willing to pay the price. It brings us all those scenes in the New Testament, the Gospels, especially when the leper kind of throws himself at the feet of Jesus. Like, you know what, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus tells him, I am willing. And Jesus touches him. So he is the kinsman redeemer. He is the goel, as he is willing, able, and he is near of kin. Thus he shall reckon with him who bought him. The price of his release shall be according to the number of years. From the year that he was sold to him until the year of Jubilee, it shall be according to the time of the hired servant for him. If there are still many years remaining, according to them he shall repay the price of his redemption from the money with which he was bought. And if there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, then he shall reckon with him, and according to his years he shall repay him the price of his redemption. He shall be with him as a yearly hired servant, and he shall not rule with rigor over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed in these years, then he shall be released in the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him. For the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This has been probably the most challenging text that I've had to go through so far in the book of Leviticus. Trusting in the Lord verbally is one of the easiest things ever. Trusting in the Lord practically is something I think we fail on daily, realistically, in all aspects of our walk. We come to the cross broken because we understand that we cannot redeem ourselves. And then we see all of these things with the prices. Like, well, you know, what was he sold for? How many years are left, if you will, on the contract? That's a scary thing because math is hard. So we're going to do gospel math. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was praying, as all his prayers are, this one is also exceptional. But he says, Lord, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. That cup, talk about drinking wrath. That's typically what we look at when we're dealing with cups, something that's also coming up for us in the book of Revelation, chapter 16. And it's wrath because that is the price, that is the penalty for sin. He who knew no sin was taking on sin. He says, Lord, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Which means this is the price to pay for the years remaining. But he said, nevertheless, your will be done. What was God's will? The only way for people to be redeemed back was the Son's blood being poured out. Life. Essentially, it would cost us our lives. It's a price that we can't pay to be redeemed. So we come to the cross kind of knowing that. But once we turn to the Lord and we start our walk with Christ, knowing that it's not works that saves us, somehow we think it's works that sustain us. So when we try to work to fulfill out our salvation, which is also not biblical. So we kind of hurt in our trust there a little bit. God calls us into things that are hard, scary, tough, or they make us feel alone. So we just don't generally want to do it. It's like, Lord, that doesn't make sense. Lots of things don't make sense to us. But if we try and reconcile the things that God is calling us to do with things that make sense to us, not a lot would get done. Because the things he calls us into, they're hard, they're scary, they're tricky to us. it really is kind of unfortunate for myself as a scholar to be able to see, all right, this is the command. And what we want to do, typically, when we see these kinds of commands, we want to go through the Word, and it's like, all right, I want to see what the outcome of this is. If they're obedient, because we want to know. We want knowledge that leads to an example, that leads to this step of faith. So we have the knowledge, we have the command, we want to see the example. Really what do we want to see? We want to see how God makes good on his end. We see this section, and what a phenomenal thing. The year of Jubilee, if you're in bondage, or if the land of your inheritance is for the time being lost, really what you're looking forward to is that call of liberation. How many of us don't raise your hands, how many of us are in debt? I would be thrilled to not have to pay for my house anymore. Could you imagine in that 50th year? But it also had that call on, you know what, you're not going to work, but you're going to survive off the stuff that you have gathered in the 6th year for the next year. We'd be very tempted to not make good. We don't have that example here. To not follow through in obedience, and we see the outcome of it. So we still technically see God make good. If you're not going to give the land the Sabbath, I'm going to give the land the Sabbath. Odds are, God is doing something in your life that does not make sense. I had a pastor who, he didn't have a lot of great wisdom, but one of the things that he always said to me, which was always kind of fascinating, is every couple of years, you just need to do something crazy. You need to do something weird. God is putting something on your heart. He's putting something in front of you. Are you going to move forward on it? And most of the time, it's the thing that just does not make sense. Because the only way that it's going to succeed is if God is in it. So it brings us right back to ground zero. The just shall live by faith. That word for faith rings true almost through the entire word. Pistis, conviction of the truth. That means you are so convinced of the truth, so convinced of the real thing, or so convinced of the outcome that you are going to follow through. We kind of gave the example of the airplane. How convinced are you that thing is going to stay in the air the way it's supposed to? Convinced enough that we're going to walk on it. Sit down, buckle up, and hope that the little seatbelt's going to hold you in place when the thing crashes in the desert. Do we have that kind of faith as we move forward in our walk with Christ? Let's pray together.